News24, and it gives me great pleasure to host you today in the beautiful home of Media24 in Cape Town. It is my privilege to welcome our guests of honor, Deputy Minister of Finance, Mcebisi Jonas, on my left, and the team from Treasury. You guys must be exhausted after yesterday's mini budget, and we truly appreciate the opportunity to interact with you on this platform. Finance Minister Gordon is on his way to the venue and will join us shortly after 7 o'clock. I also want to welcome our News24 viewers who are watching this interview via live streaming on news24.com. I encourage all of you to tweet your questions and comments during the event using the hashtag News24Praveen. I'll repeat that hashtag News24Praveen. Ladies and gentlemen in the audience, we will have a short question and answer session after the interviews with the Deputy Minister Jonas and Minister Gordon, so keep your questions ready. A light breakfast will be served afterwards through the back doors. It's now my pleasure to hand you over to my colleagues, News24 video editor Jerusha Shikti-Arab and senior Fin24 journalist Matthew Lecotier, who will conduct the interview.
Thank you, Adrian. Welcome, Deputy Minister. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'd like to kick us off with a question from one of our viewers at home. This one comes from Paddy Paisley, who wants to know what would really happen if every South African stopped paying taxes for the rest of the financial year?
That's very serious. It's very obvious. I mean, the country will collapse. That's what it means. Because I think taxes and revenue are important for everything else that we do. Both those things that we do very well, and of course those we do badly. But generally, it's very important for education, health, etc., etc. And that's why I think we insist that we should manage the public funds better.
So I will tell Mr. Paisley to please continue paying his taxes.
Speaking during the mini-budget press briefing yesterday, the minister said we need to get the noise out of the system and we need to bring back political stability. Do you know what he was referring to by this noise?
Technically, yes. Look, I mean, the reality, I think there are lessons coming out from all over the world that increasingly in conditions of economic difficulties, politics matter. I mean, if you have the right set of political environment, it ensures stability, it ensures certainty, which is very critical for investors. It also improves confidence, both business and public confidence in the system. And that's crucial. In fact, one of the factors undermining growth in South Africa at the moment is very low investor confidence. So working on that, and politics matter in dealing with that. It also gives you a sense of the regulatory environment that you're creating, as it were. So my sense is that unless you manage politics very well, you are going to get negative outcomes in the economy. So bad politics are not good for the economy.
True. Political instability is actually something that S&P flagged in its last review. And as such, do you think the mini-budget does enough to avoid a ratings downgrade?
Look, I mean, firstly, I think our message is very strong. I mean, we've got to stabilize our fiscal, and we've got to stabilize debt, we've got to manage public expenditure, and we've got to deal with inefficiencies in the system. We also have to deal with a whole range of issues around regulation, etc. We've got to create basis for growth and drive growth through either collaboration with the private sector, creating the right environment for private sector investment, etc., etc. And those messages are very strong. We're cutting expenditure, which is very important. We're introducing new revenue measures, etc. And that's the kind of expectations that most rating agencies have. And I think we did enough in that regard. With regards to political noise, if you want, and I can take off my cap as a deputy minister and speak as Mcebisi Jonas, my sense is that I think South Africans need to realize that the destiny of the country is in our hands. And I think post-independence situation, and many developing countries tend to place too much emphasis on political parties, which is good sometimes, and in many instances it advances development if you have the right political parties. But the danger, though, is that you demobilize society, you demobilize citizens, and they look up to political parties. Party barons are not good for democracy. So the danger is that you take power into party barons, and citizens are waiting for services to be delivered and this to happen without being actively determining their destiny. The big lesson I would say is that we must, in South Africa, do two things very well. The one is strengthen public opinion. People must be bold to say what they think. Secondly, you must also ensure that you have an active citizenry that's able to tell government, talk to power sense when power is senseless.
Minister, we just need to switch your microphone. I'm so sorry about that. Could you just give us 2 minutes?
That was not my problem.
No, it wasn't.
I've got many others.
Treasury gets blamed for many things, but we won't blame you for this hiccup. I just want to follow on from what we've been discussing, and that was that we really did see a theme through the minister's speech yesterday in bringing South Africans together to address these issues. He spoke a lot about the role of the public, and particularly the role of private enterprises in bolstering confidence. There are people at home who would say, I don't really know how to do this. Is it really my problem? What do you say to that?
Look, I mean, let's face it, I mean, difficult conditions, circumstances always generate some creativity. I mean, I've been just looking at the news, how civil society is coming up. I was listening to my friend Sipho Pichana yesterday, belting out interesting stuff. And there are many, I mean, churches are coming out, and you have grassroots NGOs beginning to be more assertive about what they do. And there are good lessons out there. I mean, we've got NGOs that are doing fantastic work. I mean, through our Jobs Fund, we've been able to collaborate with a number of NGOs to create jobs at a local level, massively actually, and very sustainable project. You've got businesses in South Africa that are doing so well, I mean, as it were. We have to change the mindset. I mean, our mindset, I think, where we come from a background where the state is everything. Ideologically, that's where we come from, I can confess. That's where we come from. But the lesson that's coming out of our experience and experience elsewhere is that a state-centered development path is not sustainable until you are able to realize that 75% of output in the economy is private sector, that more than 70% of jobs in our economy is private sector. If you are to drive growth, if you are to drive development, and etc., you do need to create an environment where private sector invests more. And let's face it, they are not investing now. And the reason is confidence, but also the extent to which government moves out of its way to mobilize the private sector. We've got to look at mechanisms of ensuring that we use public fund to catalyze and stimulate private investment in infrastructure, in sectors where they would not move in, and they need to move with us. We need to look at private sector participation in our SOCs. And all of these things must signal a different way of looking at this stuff. Quite frankly, our management record, I mean, in South Africa of state-owned SOCs demonstrate that we have not been able to do this thing very well in a long time. We are kind of beginning to improve now, certain things are happening, but clearly, until we actually realize that the public sector and private sector has to work together to drive development, but also civil society is also equally important.
And we certainly are going to talk about the state-owned enterprises as we go along. But as we move away from this kind of state-centric mindset that you're talking about, yesterday, though, you did describe Treasury as, and I want to quote you correctly here, the custodian of fiscal integrity. Now, that can't...
Was it me?
It was.
Okay.
It was. It was during the media briefing before. We'll play it back to you later. It can't be an easy job. And in fact, you have various ministries who you need to get on board with this plan. How's that going?
Look, I mean, it's probably Treasury is one of the few ministries whose role is almost codified in law. It's in the Constitution. It states clearly what the Treasury role is, etc. And over time, I think we've been able to, through a number of mechanisms. One, I think we've actually built a very strong technical base. I mean, at a technical level, you've got a very strong team there. Secondly, I think most of the people in Treasury have been there for a very long time. So you've got a lot of experience and institutional memory sitting there. Thirdly, that generally, I think, I mean, we've been lucky with good ministers, to be frank. Because again, it's easy to get a minister that just disrupts the whole thing or changes the direction. But lastly, I think we understand that you've got to learn from lessons and take lessons from elsewhere. Our work with World Bank, IMF, other multilateral institutions, our engagement with different countries, etc., brings a different experience to what we have in Treasury. So at one level, our authority derives from Constitution, etc. At another level, it derives from just the technical base that we have. Thirdly, obviously, the more difficult one is political support from the ruling party and everybody else. And that has not been very bad, quite frankly, despite what you see.
You've been speaking at businesses, and it's true, a lot of business leaders have spoken to us and have congratulated your efforts. But
Is it allowed?
It is.
Okay.
I think so. Let me just check on that. Yeah?
Yes.
Yeah, it's allowed. In response to the mini-budget, the Institute of Race Relations CEO, Frans Cronje, said that tax increases and austerity measures should be short-term inventions, but he's worried that they're becoming mainstay in our budgets. He said Cabinet is fiddling in the face of deepening economic crisis. What would you say to Frans?
Look, I mean, a couple of things though. The first is that we have not reached the austerity stage as a country. We're not there. I mean, we're not there. And we must avoid being there. I mean, that will entail sweeping cuts on social expenditure, that cutting down the number of employees in the public service, and we have not reached that stage. I mean, our argument as Treasury is that if we do not manage ourselves very well at this point, and if we do not start growing the economy, we will reach that point quite easily. And we have to avoid that as much as. So firstly, we are not there. I mean, we've not reached the austerity stage as a country. But secondly, I think I sympathize with the idea sometimes that we're fiddling. There's a bit of fiddling in some of these things, because I think about it, if a train is taking a particular direction, to turn it around to take a different direction really means a huge effort. But that's not true though, because the reality now is that the work that we're doing with the private sector now, I mean, is showing that there's seriousness about turning this thing around, igniting growth, etc., etc. So there's real work happening to try to deal with these issues. Is it enough? I would argue it's not enough.
When you talk about turning around trains, are you talking about PRASA?
No. I forgot I'm here. I mean, I could have avoided the analogy.
There are quite a lot of analogies around here that we can avoid. But Minister Gordon called public servants to work with integrity, honesty, and accountability, and to ensure that all efforts are directed towards the shared interests of all South Africans. He said public funds must not be diverted to private ends, and that all citizens are entitled to demand accountability and integrity from those who serve them. These are serious words, which he must have said for a reason. Why?
Look, I mean, in part, I think the corruption is real. I mean, people like talking about the perception about corruption. It is real. I mean, it's palpable. You can feel it. You can see it in most agencies, etc. So, as society, we've got to rise and ensure that we manage this thing and turn it around. I mean, and that's the point he's making. I mean, that's why our sometimes Treasury gets the flag, because our central procurement system is able to see some of these things. We are able to intervene. The Public Finance Management Act requires us to intervene in institutions and try to kind of correct some of the problems that happen in institutions. So there's been real work to try to block this thing. But and then again, I always say that corruption is not just an ethical problem, or it happens because individuals are very weak or something like that. It is also a systemic problem. It is also a systemic problem that if you have a system that actually create a context where corruption would happen, it will always happen. And part of the problem with our system is that, and then maybe their experiences elsewhere, is that it starts from the appointments of or call it deployment of ministers and what, it goes into appointment of DGs and so on and so on. If you have a system that doesn't work according to rules, then you are likely to have a problem. It has to work according to rules, that when you appoint a director general, it has to be a public process. We must be able to audit the process and say that, by the way, you are now a director general for Zile, but how did it happen? Do you have the right qualifications? How did you apply? Were there no better applicants in that thing, and so on? So we have to open up the system so that your civil servants are not your clients. So you must, by all means, avoid consolidating almost what I call a clientele system, where everybody is a client of somebody else. So the DG is a client of the minister. The DDG is the client of the DG, and it goes on like that, because then you kind of destroy the constitutional base of having the institutions as they are. Civil servants, in part, have to be independent in that sense. But secondly, I think they work within a policy framework of the ruling party. But their operations must be according to law. And that's what we need to deal with. So break the consolidation of a client, I don't know, is my English right? It sounds like Konglish. Clientele system that everybody is somebody's client in the system, and actually create a more constitutionally based system where these things are happening according to rules. That's, for me, would be the achievement. That's a systemic part of this thing. I don't think it's only bad individuals. You know, bad individuals, of course, make a system that is very weak even worse. But I think it starts with the system. I think we must strengthen our systems. And they are there, by the way, but people can. And the danger is that you have government this side, you create an informal government on the other side, and you run things according to informal government. And that's probably the recipe for a failed state, by the way.
Let's talk
I sound like a priest now.
In fact, the minister sounded a bit like a priest yesterday. I believe he quoted the Pope, if I remember correctly, and Martin Luther King. So it seems to be a trend in Treasury at the moment. I want you to talk a little bit more about the good ministers that you say Treasury has had, because they haven't had an easy run. We've seen one minister who's been moved aside, essentially sacked, unless we believe the BRICS job is coming through, and another who's facing some serious pressures from courts.
It doesn't take away. I mean, look, if you think about it, we had Trevor, a wonderful human being. I hope he is not listening to this now. but I'm saying that very forthright, very focused in the work that he's supposed to do, and yet Praveen, very good individuals also. I'm very focused, very hardworking, and so on and so on. And then Nhlanhla was a very hardworking minister, very lovely to work with, in any case, as it were, and so on and so on. So I'm saying that you have an advantage that you, from just, I don't care how they are appointed, by whom they are appointed, but I'm just saying you happen to have good personalities and good individuals in the space. It could be worse, you could get Mcebisi Jonas, who's a terrible person. So I'm just saying that we've been lucky in that sense, highly visionary, by the way. I mean, if you think about it, Trevor is some of the stuff that we're talking about today is actually built a very solid system, as it were. Praveen, highly intellectual, highly visionary, etc. So I'm just saying we're lucky in that sense.
Of course, and what I want to ask you is, when you have those visionary leaders, and I think the country agrees with you in that instance, our leaders of Treasury are probably the most respected and loved, I dare say. But we see them facing constant struggles. We see a tax against these people in these positions. So is it a difficult space to be where you
Look,
have
I mean,
visionary
let's put
leaders?
it differently. I mean, to be attacked has nothing to do sometimes with what you are capable of doing. It could point to something else. And I'm trying to have a job to protect at this point. I think the issue for me is that the context is tough. I mean, I really want to emphasize this thing. I think South Africans must embed in their minds that we are going through the toughest period economically, you know, and I think sometimes that, you know, sometimes with political parties and politicians, when things are tough, they always quote history. So when we start quoting too much from the past, it's because we can't solve the current problem. But I think they are so tough, and when things are tough, they generate all sorts of responses and panics, etc. And my sense is that the role of Treasury has become so central in actually ensuring that we move out of where we are. Now, it's natural that we attract all sorts of attention. Some very good, some very bad, but we attract all sorts of attention, as it were. But also in a context where you could see that you've got continuously to contend with protecting democracy. And it's a struggle. I mean, it's not an easy thing. But then you start getting the contestation, anything is possible, people get shafted, etc., in that context. I hope I've been nuanced enough to answer your question.
You have. Thank you.
Deputy Minister, let's talk about the new buzzword of 2016, state capture. Would you mind giving us your definition of what state capture means?
Look, I mean, I probably I'm the worst person to do that, you know, because I think. But let me say the following about it is that I guess that there's when the evolution of the state or the South African state, we call it a democratic state. That precisely because it is a democratic state, its accountability is first to South Africans. I mean, that's my understanding, that it has to account to South Africans. And that everything that we do within the state must be for the best interest of South Africans, you know. Now, everywhere it happens that as we go through that, relationships are built with different sectors of society, etc. But we've got to ensure the independence of the policy formulation process, the planning of programs in government, in such a way that all of those are planned in a manner that promotes the interest of South Africans first, and they can do something else later. But that's in essence. So in a context where you gradually see a scenario where people begin to have more influence on policy processes, and many people to use the term policy capture first, you know, because that's what starts. So you start certain sectors of the economy, and I'm saying sectors of the economy, start capture, or subsectors of the economy start capturing the policy formulation process. Everything that the state says in policy reflects what their interests are. The danger with such a situation, it consolidates concentration in the economy, it promotes marginalization, etc., etc. And that's a very dangerous state to be in. But if you go around, and I'm no academic, but I know that if you study many countries, you'd find that you have instances where gradually you have individuals who then capture the state, not just sectors, but where individuals have so big influence on the state, and therefore they begin to steer it in particular directions. I think why South Africans should be worried about the development like that is that it undermines democracy to begin with, but it also can lead to a point where it undermines the effectiveness of government and the efficiency levels in government. So that's why you have to be consciously looking at that and protecting the state and its independence as much as you can.
Now,
it could also cause something else, by the way. It could also come, sometimes people would focus on state or security apparatuses of the state. Because remember that the state in Marxist terms, it's an institution of violence, effectively. So you take charge of state institutions, and you start directing them in different directions and so on. It can have disastrous consequences. But finally, if the population loses confidence in the state because their perception is that it is not working in their interest, it can create huge instabilities in the system and even undermine development across the board. So that's why you have to nip it in the bud if you can. That's my view, and actually try to mobilize society against it and ensure that society speaks against it and get focus on it. So I welcome, the insistence on the issue. They've been really vocal to say we must avoid.
So speaking of nipping it in the bud, it's on the public record that you were offered a role by the Gupta family, and you were also interviewed by our outgoing public protector.
I could have written you a letter to persuade you not to ask me that question.
Okay, but I'm going to move along from it. What I want to know from you is, having been a part of the process in the interviews with the outgoing public protector, and you've mentioned briefly now the ANC's stance on it. What do we need to be doing practically as a country? What measures do we need to put in place?
Again, I'm coming back to the issue. I swear, and I do that seriously, that we have a strength in South Africa. Our public opinion is strong in this country. But public opinion alone is not going to solve the problem. We also need to have mechanisms that promote the development of active citizenry. So I'm not going to tell you how to do that, but I think, we need to take ourselves out of the mindset that says that it's political parties that determine our destiny. It is citizens that must determine our destiny. Now, there are many things that political parties will always avoid, and irrespective of what the political parties are, everywhere in the world they will shy away from those things. But having active citizenry is fundamentally important, not because we are where we are, but just because it actually promotes democracy. It's a very strong guarantee for accountability beyond some of the things that we do. Because then when your constitution starts being eroded, some of your constitutional values are eroded, civil societies and active citizenry can stand up and actually assert itself around that. But it's also a guarantee for greater public consciousness about where the country should be going, about building stronger national identity, and a whole range of other things. There are huge benefits if we do that. So all what I'm saying, I would say we have two pillars that we have lost touch with, and it's public opinion. Let's protect it, let's strengthen it, let's be out there with our articles, with our newspaper articles, and so on, and say the things that we want to say. Secondly, I think it is the active citizenry role, where we get our citizens to get into the space of actively participating, create structures to allow that to happen.
Speaking of news and newspapers, it must keep you on your toes sometimes. Just last Sunday, the Sunday Times came out with this affidavit that you had been offered.
I don't know where they got it.
Well, obviously, I wasn't going to ask you that question, by the way. But yeah, that news story said that the Lufthansa offered you 600,000 Rand and then 600 million Rand. When you see a newspaper article like that, what's your reaction?
Look, it's good to have those things. I think the more it's like I always say that if you have a treasury that's loved by everybody, then there's a problem, in government at least, then there's a problem. Because they are supposed to be ensuring that these things are aligned, et cetera, et cetera. Now, once you start becoming darling of departments, then there's a serious problem. So it's the same thing. Newspapers must actually understand that you are not always going to be loved. In fact, maybe the more you are not loved, the better. Because then you become more focused on investigating your stories and ensuring that you put out the good stories that could actually enlighten the public better.
Minister Jonas, I think the two things we're taking away from this is don't try and be loved, and we need an active citizen base. Thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for your time.
Thank you. And thank you to the audience.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm good.